In one of the most famous moments in sports history, Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swing, the great baseball player, stepped up to the plate in a World Series game, and he pointed straight to center field as if to say, I'm going to knock this ball right out of the park. And that's exactly what he did. It came to be known as Babe Ruth calling his shot. Well, in this game, Hans Niemann calls his shot. Just a couple of days before this, he was interviewed, and they asked him how he thought he was going to do in the rest of the tournament. And he said he looked at the players he was going to face, and he really felt that he should win the remaining games. Wow. That is what he said. Well, did he call his shot? Let's look at this game. This is the game he played against Alexander Lenderman. Niemann has white, Lenderman has black. Let's jump right in. D4, D5, C4, C6, the Slav defense. Knight F3, Knight F6, E3, and bishop to G4. Alex Lenderman gets his bishop outside of the pawn chain. Knight C3, E6. And now Hans Niemann goes after that bishop. Knight to E5. And now he just takes it. So he has the two bishops now. Then G5 gains a little space, kicks the knight. The knight goes to E4. But after exchanging knights on E4, he has to defend this G5 pawn, which he does with H4. Now bishop to B4 check. Interestingly, Hans Niemann had this exact position in December of 2021, but with the black pieces. And in that game, he played queen to A5 check, but it transposes to this game after bishop B4, bishop to D2, queen A5, A3, and trades on D2. We have a very complex endgame. Both sides have space in different sectors of the board, but the main issue here is the bishop versus the knight. That's our main imbalance in this position. Black plays F5. You don't want to take en passant here because that just allows black to sort of fix his structure. White plays C5 before black gets a chance to. King to E7, E5 attacking in the center was also a decent idea. King to E7, B4 strengthening the pawn chain, and rook A to D8. Now in my database, this says this is a novelty, but other people say this is not a novelty. There are other games played here. Hans Niemann in his game played A6 to slow down the advance of the queenside pawns. After rook A to D8, he steps out of the way, king to C3, and now E5. Now, Hans Niemann plays bishop to C4. You don't want to really take on E5 because, and then after knight E5, this knight is really well placed. It's a sort of a tower of strength on that E5 square, so you don't want to do that. Bishop to C4, and now ED4 check, pawn takes. And he's greatly limited the mobility of this knight. There aren't a lot of squares that this knight can land on. So black plays knight to F8 to try to reroute the knight to the E6 square where he can put some pressure on this D4 pawn. And here, Hans Niemann plays the number one computer recommendation and a really strong move, F3. He wants to open up that E-file, deliver check, and he wants to liquidate black's space advantage. I mean, this pawn on E4 is quite powerful. So after taking, first he takes the pawn, rook A to F1, king goes to D7. If, by the way, he plays knight to E6 here, then rook to E1, just pins the knight. It's attacked twice. The best black could do would be to give up the exchange with bishop takes D5. So instead, he plays the king to D7, and now rook to F3. And here Hans Niemann has a serious threat of rook to E3, because with the rook on E3, this knight would have very little future. You know, it wouldn't have many places to go after that. So he has to develop that knight now before it's too late. And he plays knight to E6, putting pressure on D4, also threatening knight to G5 because there's a pin on this H4 pawn. And that's a critical issue as the game progresses. The rook goes to E1, hits that knight. The knight moves out of the way, goes to C7. And here you can see when you compare the two minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, Hans Niemann's bishop is clearly superior to the knight, although Alex Lenderman does have pressure on the H4 pawn. Rook to H3 to defend that pawn. Now rook D to E8. Black would love to trade off one pair of rooks. He has less space, so he's happy with trading some pieces, and he would leave this rook against this rook with pressure on the H4 pawn, which is what happens. Rook takes, king takes, and you could say this is equal or that white is a bit better. It looks like white's a bit better to me, but it's the better side of an equal position. A4, gaining space on the queen side, advancing. King to D7, and now B5. Opening up this B4 square so white's king can penetrate and maybe create problems on the queen side. And now knight to E6. Hoping for knight to G5. But Hans Niemann has seen a little bit deeper, and he goes ahead and he plays king to b4. So let's look at a couple of options. Black could play knight to d4, but then just rook to d3 pins the knight. If black takes on h4, just the king moves to c3, and the knight is lost. Well, what about knight to g5? I mean, that's what all the hubbub is about, right? Well, after that, rook to g3. And when the knight moves, rook takes g6. Hitting the knight twice, the g7 pawn would fall and black would be lost. So he can't take on g5 in this position. So Lenderman plays knight to f4, hitting the rook on h3. The rook moves, and now king to c7. Hans Niemann continues his queenside expansion with a5. Now he's threatening to play b6 with check. Now, it may look like he's just locking up the structure and losing his pawn breaks, but if he plays b6, he can always break later with this pawn or even sacrifice a bishop for one of these remaining pawns, and black cannot allow b6 here. It's just too dangerous. So he goes ahead and takes on b5. Bishop takes b5, now a6, and Hans Niemann plays bishop to a4. Perhaps better was bishop to c4 because it controls so many squares for this knight. This knight cannot go to any of these squares without being captured. The idea behind bishop to a4, though, is to sort of help escort this d-pawn to the queening square. The bishop stays on that key diagonal. A knight to e6 is played attacking this d4 pawn. d5 was played, and now knight to g5. And that variation we saw earlier does not work because if white tries, say, rook to g2, now rook takes h4 with check. And he doesn't have time for the pressure that he had in that other variation. So instead, d6 check is played. Now here's where the rubber meets the road. Black has a move that draws and a move that loses. The move, you still have to play well after making the drawing move, but the right move is king to c8. And what that does is it allows the rook to go to d8, the knight can re-enter the position, and it sort of helps control this queening square. The move he played, however, is a mistake. He plays king to d8. And the reason this is an error is because this bishop combined with this pawn control these three squares in front of black's position. And that means that Hans Niemann can use potential mating threats to take advantage of this king as he goes along. So now Hans Niemann has one winning move, and he plays it. c6, the only move that wins. Now, pawn takes. Now, it would be a blunder here to take on c6. He wouldn't lose, but after knight to e4, black holds the position. Not only does he attack this pawn, but he also keeps the king from defending it at c5. So the right move here, and the one Hans Niemann plays, is king to c5 right now. Obviously, you can't play king to d7 because bishop takes c6 is with check. Knight e4, king c6, and the threat of rook to b2, rook to b8 is really hard to deal with. By the way, that was another reason why the king should have been on c8, because it helps control that square. So Alex Lenderman in this position plays f4. He says, well, if you're going to break through, I'm at least going to try to distract you with my own pawn on the f-file. Now, rook to b2, king to c6 also wins. However, bishop c6, and after rook to h5, threatening a discovery against the king, black might be able to hold that position. After f4, rook to b2, threatening rook to b8 check, knight to e6 check, king takes c6. He's threatening mate at the moment, so black has to keep white occupied. Knight to d4 check. The king goes to d5. He's attacking the knight. He's threatening rook to b8 check. So Alexander Lenderman plays knight to b5, trying to block the rook's access to b8. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and here, rook takes pawn. That would be a blunder, because of rook to h5, check, and after exchanging rooks, this f-pawn could advance, and it would actually be checking on this square. So let's just say, look at it here, king takes, boom, and then when this pawn gets to this square, it actually would be a check. And that's an extra tempo, so that would be a really bad blunder to take that pawn, but Hans Niemann's technique is excellent in this position. He plays king to c6. a6 also wins here, by the way. But king to c6, king to e8, king to c7, king to f7, and after d7, Alexander Lenderman resigns. There's just too much pressure on his position. If he plays, say, king to e7 to try to control this square along with the rook, white just plays rook to e1, or e2, excuse me, check. And after king to f6, the rook can go to e8, or he could maybe just queen and play the position that way. It's just an easy win for white. And Hans Niemann won his game. He called his shot, pointed to center field, and got his victory. If you enjoyed this terrific game, I have another game I think you're really going to enjoy from Hans Niemann. Be sure to check out this game right here. I think you'll like it.